Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Miss Jai, and I'm very excited for Ask Miss Jai Live today. So, if this is your first time tuning in, please stick around so you have an opportunity to hear a bit from our special guest, who I'll introduce in just a moment. If you are watching live, please feel free to put live in the chat or hashtag live in the chat. Let us know any questions you might have as those come up as well. If you're catching this on the replay, go ahead and put a hashtag replay in the chat. And please share with us what you found the most interesting or useful from today's conversation. So like I said, my name is Miss Jai. I use feminine and masculine pronouns like she, her, and he, him. And I'm very excited to have the opportunity to sit down and chat today with Dr. Erik Escareño. So if you could please introduce yourself, share your pronouns, a little bit about yourself and your work.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Erik James Escareño, and all my pronouns are all genders. I use she, they, he, and I am two-spirited. And you said a little bit about myself. There was a lot of questions, I think.
Sorry, I just got so excited.
Born and raised in Los Angeles. My family comes from mostly from Arizona, Texas, part of the Yavapai and Chiricahua Apache tribes, and as well as Mexican. So let me back up for a second. What do I do? I'll tell you, don't worry. Most of the stuff that I actually do is specialized mental health services within the deaf and hard of hearing community, queer, trans, non-binary, mental health that has been very challenging to get and access, and even more so finding providers that are from community. So we do telehealth medicine for those on the internet, as well as those within California. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here today and for agreeing to come on and chat a little bit about your work and what has brought you to this. I'm really excited for us to get a chance to talk today. And we were talking a little bit before going live as well, and it's just really lovely to see you and to engage in this way.
Absolutely.
So I guess to kick us off, what motivated you to start Wombat Mental Health Services?
I have been in most nonprofit spaces for a very long time. I've worked in Los Angeles County in different capacities. Most of it has been like an HIV field work, and becoming a master's in social work, so an MSW. I have kind of really fine-tuned and kind of focused on mental health services. And I started to see a lot of inequities around POC, BIPOC, trans folks, indigenous folks, and most also is deaf and hard of hearing folks and people in the disability community. So I just was chatting with people about how to start something that might be equitable and accessible. And our vision at Wombat Mental Health Services is really to close the mental health gap. And so providing accessible mental health services to anybody and everybody as much as possible. And creating those kind of pathways from people that look like us, that are from our community, without exploiting and mining within our own community.
So what are some ways that that you would go about or have gone about so far creating services that aren't exploitative for our community, but are still providing those services and helping to bring folks into the fold and give folks the opportunity to get services?
Yeah, so some of the challenges have really been about, so first, I think I should explain what exploitative types of services have been out there in the world. And so oftentimes when folks come with large grants, large agencies will apply for those particular grants, and they may not know anything about that particular community. And worse, they may even just cause more damage. So they may employ at a peer level or some kind of like peer educator to gain access and then insert themselves. And then they kind of like mine the community, and then, oh, we have access, we have roots here. And some of those interventions are not probably sustainable, as well as probably more harmful than anything. So that's what that looks like on that side. For us, the idea and intention is to be able to create pathways. So educating very specialized folks from our community to give them interventions that are sustainable, culturally appropriate, and as well as being able to say, we're from our own community, we're building this, and you're not going to ever just be at a peer level, but really paying people well. Having access to our communities means that we're being gentle, as well as making sure that we are not being disruptive to our communities. And so we're equipping our staff to be able to be knowledgeable. Not everyone is like from every single community, right? But we are employing those who look like us, know what's up in our community, and is able to kind of like then create healing within our own kind of bubble versus having to rely on other agencies that may get the bigger grants, but then are also causing harm just to gain access to our communities.
Yeah. I think something that you just shared that is kind of sticking in my mind is this idea of like no one person is going to reflect all of the communities we serve at all times. And I'm wondering what are some ways that you're supporting staff and supporting the folks that you're bringing in to make sure that they are able to provide relevant services, like cross-cultural services to folks, because I think oftentimes in nonprofit and in health, there trans people become tokenized as like you're the trans person, so you should work with all trans people in our services. And so, but then we end up funneling all trans people to one person. And when that person is out of the office or is no longer in the position, then trans people are unable to get services. So, what are some ways that
Right.
you're kind of breaking down those barriers?
Oh, such that is a big issue in general. So they burn out, right? So like as a non-binary, two-spirited person, male presenting, right? For most agencies, they'll often say like, "Oh, I'm a unicorn. I'm multilingual. I'm hard of hearing. I sign." So like they'll give me all of the clients, and often working in those environments, it felt not only was it exploitative, but there was really no way for them to care for me. They want access from people like us, but they don't want the historical trauma or the other traumas that might come into play. In fact, they just want a neatly packaged thing, right? Don't bring any of that mess here. Don't bring your problems here at work. So that very thing is providing additional services means that we're paying our folks well. We're getting them extra training that we're also trying to develop as at the same time. We don't have all the answers right now, but we're open to making sure that like everyone has equal footing in the regard of what else can we do differently. What has been working so far has just been being open, honest, and willing to be able to have conversations around like what would be the best approach. And I don't have all the answers, um, but somebody may, like I may be able to reach out and say like this is the specific training that we need, or if they need additional training for our staff. Right now, because we're so small, we're trying to make sure that one of our goals is to be able to get just healthcare. But I can tell you right now, after doing it like a fiscal analysis of other kind of competing positions that for the same exact positions, we're paying more than the highest of what that is. And so my intention is to make sure that when we're asking people to do the hard work, and this is the hard work, right? Like working in mental health is not an easy anything, right? To be able to work with our community and have that dual insider outsider kind of perspective. And that is such a colonized way to think about things, and trying to really kind of merge ourselves and say, we're going to get paid well, we're going to take care of our employees, as well as making sure that if they need a break, that we're kind of distributing appropriately. So we're not millions of us. There's like few of us. There's only a few of us. So making sure that we have a very strategic, kind of like dedicated strategic plan to make sure that we can hire on and train people appropriately to be culturally sustainable. Culturally sustainable is something that I started to develop as making sure that we're not um, we're taking care of our people, right? And in the community sense, on every single level, we are doing the things to make sure that the interventions that we're creating that have been around for a long time not only are billable, but also making sure that we can use them without burning us ourselves out. So taking breaks, if someone needs to like take a day off, take a day off. Like all of this work is really hard. And I think that's the hard part because people want to just, oh, you know what, I'm going to keep working and we have take time off, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And can you speak a little bit more when you talk about cultural sustainability? Can you speak a little bit more to what that looks like when the experiences of our community can be so different? So, what does cultural sustainability look like for staff members and for the folks they're bringing in, but also cultural sustainability around the development and implementation of interventions?
Sure. So before, we started to recognize that we need to have words and jargon around culturally competent. And I loathe that word, right? And that's still around today. Culturally competent is like someone can go get a certificate and be culturally competent in some kind of area of expertise that's not their own. And that's the problem is that oftentimes people from other communities will come in and say, well, I'm an expert on culturally competent. And from there, it became culturally appropriate or culturally sensitive. One of those two words, right? They started replacing those and saying, like, oh, okay, we're culturally sensitive. And oftentimes, I would working in a lot of different capacities within everywhere, right? Whether it's nonprofit, for profit, I started to recognize how um, business tends to step in within the guise of, hey, we're culturally sensitive, right? But you better work to the bone. We're going to exploit all of the resources and access that you possibly could have. And that goes on both ends, right? Like people that are in the community and it's disruptive because it's not necessarily the type of interventions that are culturally sustainable for long term. And then it wreaks havoc on those who they're trying to get in as professionals like myself to be able to say this is sustainable work, right? It's in disalignment with what I do as a person that's not only indigenous but also come from like very very niche types of communities. So although it's highly sought, it's like they don't really understand that these interventions can be damaging, even providing them that way. At some point, it gets really weird because then I have to like turn around and say, oh, well, I have to put in these codes and I have to talk to my community one way, and then I have to put it in the note
Mhm.
differently, right? I have to alter it. And so culturally sustainable is a concept that I started to really grapple around because we talk about like eco-friendly things, like how could we be culturally sustainable? How could we be sustainable in general, like with our energy and all that stuff? But we don't talk about people being sustainable that way. And with COVID-19, we've had a really big, like that exposed every single kind of facet of our healthcare, government, all things, bare bones. We already knew it was kind of bad and rotten to begin with, but they just kind of like hit the nail on the head, right? And so when people were getting tired, what we were doing wasn't culturally sustainable. In fact, it just wasn't sustainable in general for people. So, what it looks like to be culturally sustainable is to be able to, again, really kind of train people up, treat them well, make sure that we're checking in with like how are you feeling, how are you doing, creating interventions that are for us by us. Like no intervention should be created without the people that we're serving. Like we have stakeholders that are in the community. I'm in the community. And so it's just like, and it feels weird to even say stakeholders, but that's the jargon, right? Like it's
Yeah.
really just
Hmm.
like we're creating better community members that are professional, and then also how we can actually deliver that in real time with our community without it being disruptive, without it being like, well, here you should do this. Here's a better suggestion. And most of these practices have been around. So like when people talk about like smudging and medicine and what that would look like in the indigenous community, but oftentimes it's appropriated. And so like how do we integrate what indigenous medicines have been like we can use in our interventions, but then also like how do we do that for our supporting staff? So making sure that like they're not overworking and making sure that the flexibility that they have, everything's remote. So like really supporting our staff members to not only engage but try to make sure that they're not overworking. I'm not trying to like I'm not trying to like work 80 hours, you know, like we don't need that. That is that whole ideology of overworking is a concept that was produced and really perpetuated by colonization. In fact, that whole idea of like you can work harder and faster is a social construct from like just colonization, the white
Yeah.
devil, if you will.
Yeah.
So
It Yeah, that I really appreciate the dedication to wellness of not just the wellness of the community, but recognizing the importance of wellness for staff and the importance of recognizing that we are the community that we serve, because it does oftentimes feel like that falls on our shoulders to really like run ourselves into the ground in order to provide these services to our community because they are so necessary and needed and so infrequently provided in a way that is appropriate to us.
yeah, I mean, we're tired at some point, you know, like I'll never forget it. I was a mental health staff volunteer at a trans camp, and this trans kid came up to me and was talking about having like microaggressions, right? Like microaggressions, and tired of having to explain over and over again what that means to people. Full adults, right? That's the worst part. It's like full adults who are like grappling with some of these things. They're like, we're tired. And I just told them, you know, like we don't all have bad days on the same time. We're not all tired at the same time. Take a break, kiddo. You know, like just take a break. And when you're ready, there's adults like us that can take on that. So we all need to just watch out for each other. That really is that like core concept of like, are you okay? And if not, take a break, you know, and then I'll go. I need breaks. I mean, I love a good nap. But like, it's just, it really is checking in and having breaks and not that bullshit of like self-care. Cause I think self-care has been like, is terrible. And it really puts the onus on the person that you're not taking care of yourself. In fact, I've said multiple times in lots of meetings, again across the board, and when they're saying like how are you doing self-care, and I'm like, well, what are you doing to change the isms that are kind of running rampant in your system? It's the
Mm.
same reason why I don't believe in imposter syndrome, because they're not addressing the institutional racism, the institutional ciscentrism. I don't like to say transphobia because it just seems like again we're putting the words on us, and I really really believe in words, but heterocentrism, the same. All of these kinds of isms that are running rampant, they don't look inward to say like, what are we doing to address this? In fact, they'll say, why aren't you doing self-care? Like, well, you make it very hard to actually not take self-care, take the time that I might need to take a breath. And they don't understand that part. That's what I'm saying. Like, oftentimes they don't want the historical trauma that might come with, nor will they understand what that historical trauma looks like. So there's a lot of privilege that comes with working with other agencies who may not necessarily understand fully, just like even the microaggressions that come with that.
Yeah. I was recently talking to someone about the related but a little unrelated about funding and the way that programs are funded to support the trans community, and that oftentimes those programs then hire trans people to provide services, and if the programs fail, then the trans people who are in those positions are blamed for like, oh, we didn't meet our metrics because you weren't reaching out enough, you weren't doing these pieces. And so it's similar in this idea of like we're being blamed for being tired. We're being blamed for not having these programs in place or not having these systems in place to actually get into our communities where we need to get. And so that
Exactly.
can be, it really perpetuates this cycle then of like, oh, well, we've tried to create programs for trans people in the past, or we've tried to do this in the past and it just hasn't worked. So I
How much
really, that
pressure is
was,
that?
yeah,
That's a lot
it's a
of
lot.
pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's what I'm
Well,
saying, like, and like, that's all of the program like, most agencies, when they don't know, they'll hire people at the lowest level. Why aren't they on these boards, like, these agencies boards? Why aren't they, like, CEOs? Why aren't they at, like, officer levels, right? And so that's why like I'm very very happy and proud that like the majority of our board is all people of color of different walks of life, different genders, different ethnicities, different backgrounds, different disabilities. And so it's that kind of thing. So
yeah.
it's uplifting in that way where we're sustainable in the fact that we're getting people to higher positions rather like the basic lowest position.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have some questions for you then about Wombat Mental Health Services. So what is your vision for Wombat Mental Health Services in the future? Your pie in the sky dream for what you hope this becomes.
My pie in the sky is like closing the mental health gap, ending inaccessible mental health services. Anybody should be able to walk in anywhere and say, I need help. I need mental health services available.
Mm.
And they can get in the language that they need it in. They can find like other queer people. They can see themselves and their therapist. And not every single time you need to have somebody that's exactly like you, but at least understand. It's probably the most frustrating and number one thing reason why people just kind of give up on therapy is one, it's not well explained enough. The interventions are super colonized or whitewashed or just white in general. And then the worst part is they have to over explain every single time, every aspect of their life. And it's one thing when you're crying about like something like so that's heartbreaking, and then having to educate your therapist on something without having the like the knowledge or the base of that. It's so disruptive to the therapeutic process. So my vision is just to make sure that anyone can walk in at any time, virtually or not, and make sure that they can have equitable, accessible services. That's the
Yeah,
pie in the sky. That's my
absolutely.
dream.
Absolutely. And you'd mentioned a little bit about some like whitewash interventions. Are there any that are coming to mind in particular that have this lens that are
Sure.
difficult to, yeah, I'd love to hear about
Mindfulness,
it.
EMDR, there's tons, yoga. I mean, like, let's break that down, right? Like, people like Pilates, yoga, all of those particular things are not where they came from. And worse, they're not done appropriately. So, there's a lot of things when it comes to how we create and do research for some of these evidence based practices. And some of the root of them have been appropriated. And
Mm.
so, like, folks that are like, wow, this culture is really doing this thing, this mindfulness is breathing, this like diaphragmatic breathing, and that really may come from somewhere else, you know? Um, and not to say that it's not like terrible to use those interventions. But what would be great is like paying homage to those where it comes from and maybe actually practicing it correctly and not exploiting the fact of like, oh, we're doing guru work or I'm a shaman or any of those things. And I hear that often about like how people may be kind of using those things. And the biggest and the most appropriate one now currently is like the use of psychedelics and other types
Mm.
of like forms. It is extremely expensive. The person who came up with psilocybin mushrooms uh, from Mexico, she died and destitute because people went over there to want to get high and trip out and do all these things. And when used appropriately, it could really do really good for folks who have like chronic depression or substance use disorder or these things that our minds don't really understand all the way. And um and for people like me that come from these particular cultures that want to access those things, we're I'm blocked, not only legally but also just like all of I would have to pay thousands of dollars to be able to say I'm a provider now, right? But who that money going to? That money's going to more white people who have now colonized and appropriated something that's not even theirs. And it is an intervention that is successful and is useful. I mean, even Bill W. from Alcoholics Anonymous, his higher power awakening moment was mushrooms. And I always like it throws me off because I'm like, whoa, that whole concept has been erased on
Yeah.
what was actually working, right? And so then there's a long period of not using it, and now there's a resurgence. But who has the most power in actually using and driving that intervention are not the people that created that as from their culture. And so that was just plain out appropriation, right? But it's good money right now. You know, Will Smith is going down, go getting ayahuasca. People are like, oh, I'm gonna have this vision, this journey, you know,
Mhm.
and that's great. I'm all for having the journey. It should be used as medicine. It should be cognizant. It should be guided. It's a journey for those folks, but it's not always treated that way. And the folks that needed it, wanted it. That whole town became like a hippie town, you know, in Mexico. It was just, it's so sad. And you know, and then the scientists here are getting rich. You know,
Yeah.
the money is going, that the equity and the money are going elsewhere, and it's not going into that town that it came from.
Yeah. Thank you so much for expanding on that and sharing some examples as well. I think especially for the folks who are tuning in and are less familiar with where interventions come from and how the like things like psilocybin mushrooms and the use of these, how they have been taken from folks and now are being
Mm.
said, oh, well, now they're medicine. I think it's helpful for us to have that context and to really recognize like how insidious it is and how frequently this is happening. So, not necessarily for the folks who are self-proclaiming gurus or shamans, but just for mental health professionals in general. What recommendations would you give on how to better serve deaf, disabled, trans, and indigenous communities?
Um, There is, you have a good night. Let me see. There's tons. There is ways to be able to make sure that your web page is accessible. You have interpreters on brand. The biggest, if you're providers, if you're a provider out there, please, 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 please budget for accommodations. That's probably the biggest mishap, right? And and one of the most egregious things that I find to be most offensive is like doing the bare minimum. You
Mm,
know, like I think most entitlement, even if they get my, like, if I walk into a Starbucks, I expect my coffees to be like whatever my coffee is, right? And instead of just kind of like, if it's wrong, I'm going to go back and ask for something different, right? But I just want you to like think for just a second, like folks who might be deaf, disabled, people of color, queer, indigenous, they go to these things, and then what? They get rerouted somewhere else. And it's not like they can just come back and ask for somebody else and somebody different. We don't have enough mental health providers. So what it looks like in actually providing that is budgeting, getting higher education, collaborating with community members and other folks that are doing the work. You know,
mm,
there are really great programs all over. It's not about reinventing the wheel. It's about how we can come together as a community to be able to really address some of these systemic issues,
mm,
and uh, and then also like taking a break. You know, because the biggest part of it is like we're all community members, right? Just because one day I became a doctor doesn't mean I'm outside of my community. It sometimes feels that way. You know, it can be a little isolating sometimes. But the challenge is now most of all is what we can do better is more funding, more grants, more access, and then creating something absolutely new. Because we don't have to take what we've been doing so far and saying like, well, that's the model and we should just kind of do it that way. And I was explaining to you earlier, like what that actually looks like for even for our models. Like, I was trying to explain to my lawyer, like, hey, we want to like create shirts. We are for profit, with a social justice lens, because I have found that nonprofits to be exploitative. Not all, you know, and but it really creates dependencies, and the really ones that suffer and lose are those who are working in those nonprofits, because there's either guilt of you have to work more, or you have high productivity, you're not getting paid well, and the community is benefiting, but the workers are not. And then that's my concern, you know. So like being able to explain that to my lawyer and saying like, hey, we want to ask for like money so we can give free services away to people for free, or use shirts. And the response was usually something around like, well, like they were trying to like ask questions like, well, can you just do it this other way? And I was like, no, 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 no. We just want to give free things away. Like I want to give free
Yeah.
therapeutic services away. And the goal is to be able to like make sure that we can have accessible mental health services. Knowing who, so if you're ever confused, there are tons of resources. GLAD, there's trans coalitions across the nation. It's looking and reading legislation and law. And trust me when I say research is a huge component as to how we can get more services, evidence-based or not. But there's a ton of there's a ton of research out there that says we need more research to be done. And
At the end of
it
every research, actually,
yeah,
that's exactly what it says.
it'll say like, hey, this is the discussion, more research needs to be done. And so
Mhm.
building that, a lot of people think, well, it's just doing the work with the one-on-one. And in social work, there's this ideology around like the micro, which is the individual person, the meso, which is like community based, and then there's like macro, which is like global and legislative and law. And we suffer in making sure that we can create systemic change, so then that way we have access at the highest level. And so like it's great we do community work here, but it should mirror across. So if we do more work in the nation, if we do more work at a federal level, government level, and the best part, and I will just say this out loud, if someone tells you no, it's not possible, go show them, go do it. And I think that's probably the most freeing experience of like, there's always a different way. And being creative and flexible in serving the deaf, disabled, and other types of communities, indigenous communities, is like we can kind of create our own thing. Like we don't have to rely on the same concepts of what was kind of driving us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, then, what words of advice then, or encouragement, or affirmation would you like to share with some of the trans, non-binary, two-spirit people who might be listening to this and are trying to navigate mental health services?
I'm gonna read a quote from
Okay.
this book. It's probably one of my favorite quotes. I actually read it to almost everybody. And the book is Yellowtail, A Crow Medicine Man and Sundance Chief. And it says, this quote is from Crazy Horse from Sioux Nation. We did not ask you white men to come here. The Great Spirit gave us this country as a home. You had yours. We did not interfere with you. The Great Spirit gave us plenty of land to live on, and buffalo, deer, antelope, and other game. But you have come here. You are taking my land from me. You are killing off my game, our game. So it is hard for us to live. Now you tell us to work for a living. But the Great Spirit did not make us to work, but to live by hunting. You white men can work if you want to. We do not interfere with you. And again you say, why do you not become civilized? We do not want your civilization. We would have lived as our fathers did, and our fathers before them. And I say that because navigating this, reindigenizing as a person, there has been extreme um, erasure. And I mean, almost every single problem I can think of, I just really blame on colonization, racism, recidivism, you know, heterocentrism, like all of it, all these genders, all the genders, the binary, all of that stuff. So if you are in any one of the communities that I serve, that I'm in, that I belong to, I will speak to you directly that how and what you are accessing right now in this world was not made for you, not created by you, but we can create something different. And that is a promise that if we are able to, accessing mental health is extremely confusing and it shouldn't be. And so um, reach out, like ask. And even if it's like we can't serve you, I will try to find some like access points. Like I think that's the most difficult part is like you go somewhere and then they're like, well, I'm sorry, I can't help you. You know, when someone that's deaf that comes in to an agency and I don't know, I've never seen a deaf person, right? And they're like, do you read Braille? And I'm like, they're deaf, like, and I'll be like, hi, welcome. My name is Eric. Hmm, how could I help you? How could I support you? Support. One of the things that as we're working at actively decolonizing versus re-indigenizing, and those are two different concepts for me. Decolonizing is really attacking the system, and I'm not decolonizing myself. I might unlearn some colonization and what some of those things are, and getting rid of some of the binary, even just words in general. But that's really me revolting around the system that kind of exists. And as I indigenize as a person and re-indigenize, it's my body remembering. I'm awakening to what magic there is. There's magic in my blood. It's touching my ancestors, and they're informing me of how to move forward and how to proceed. It is those kinds of things, and how I can gracefully integrate my own practices, because I can't go backwards. I can't go back to what I don't know, but I can feel what I do know and how I can create something new for others, and we can create something new together. And that's going to look completely different from what was given. So if you're ever feeling discouraged, yeah, it's meant to do that. But you're not alone. There's always ways to ask for help. There's always ways to seek support. And that doesn't have to involve like feeling embarrassed or ashamed, because this was not meant for you. This world is not meant for you.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And to everyone who's listening, I really hope for the providers, I hope that you're really picking up these gems that you're dropping, because you're really giving us so much information and sharing so much of your expertise with us. And for all the folks who are struggling to navigate these spaces, like thank you for sharing that medicine with us and helping us to recognize where what has been created and why these systems are specifically so difficult to navigate for some of us. So I do want to move us to our last question, which is a little bit of a different question, but I do like to cap these interviews with just knowing what brings you joy.
Mm. Well, um, I think the biggest thing that brings me joy, the instant, the thing that came to mind was actually hook suspensions. Um,
Okay.
and the reason why that brings me so much joy is because I feel extremely grateful for the life I have got to live and lead and learn, and the person I've become. Um, and I think that that's probably one of the hardest things that I ever could have possibly done, but I was so prepared and ready. It wasn't a way to shed or like process any of those things. It was, I am so rooted in my culture, in my heritage, in my people, that the blood that runs through me is really solidified in like spirit, and um being really secure to lend my power when others may not. And uh and when I think about it that way, like I've been through a whole hell of a lot, like the amount of the percentage is like 0.004% of like people with being judicially impacted. uh Being through all the things that I've been through, and just in general, like to be where I'm at right now, uh it shouldn't have happened that way. So the things that bring me joy are being able to do things so out of the box that it lives in my head rent free, right? And I just start to dispel all of those things. And doing things like that centers me in a way that allows me to tell others, I got you. I'm going to sacrifice my flesh so my community can then move forward with me. And what brings me most joy is being able to move my community closer to an indigenous way of living. And there again, I get to learn from my elders. I get to learn from others because I didn't grow up on the res. Like there's a huge like we grew up in East LA, like that was our home, like we grew up in LA and that was it. And those ideologies and concepts were so foreign to us. But being in that space of in between was such a spiritual way to be uplifted. You know, I don't know how any other way. It's like lifting up in the air. And I showed it to my grandparents. My grandparents like, "Oh, this is beautiful," and I hang it on the wall, right? Like it's like stuff like that when I show people, and I'm extremely proud of these particular moments. It brings me such joy to be able to say, like, that's the medicine that I come from, and that's where I need to be, and that's where I need to belong, and that's what I need to show to others because um, I no longer have to fear being anything else than my most authentic self as a two spirited indigenous person with all of these facets of myself, and they all get to be one. And that moment, I understood that that's where I got to be. And being in that in between and being lifted up, that's what brings me most joy. Is I can be my most authentic self, and I can share that with others, and I can more importantly show others how to do that for themselves.
Thank you so much for sharing that, for sharing your joy, for sharing so much of your expertise tonight and so much of yourself tonight. How can folks connect with you and your practice?
Well, absolutely. Thank you for sharing me. I'm extremely honored to be able to talk about these things with you. But how people can find me are all the social media. Really is wombatmhs.com is our mental health practice website. I'm on LinkedIn, Instagram. There's all the almost everywhere you can probably find me. Uh, but if you want to check out our services, you can definitely go onto our website. And we're going to be doing a Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos virtual ofrenda. So if we would invite folks who want to participate in that to drop people that they want to celebrate and uh, celebrate their passing and their life on that day. So and we are also giving out some free tips. So definitely our website and all the social media. I think there's a link, right? Somewhere. I
Yes.
think there's a link
So for
somewhere.
for folks who are tuning in, the descriptions for the replay will have all of the website and places that you can find Wombat MHS and connect up with you all. So thank you again so much for being here. Thank you again for sharing so much of your time and your energy and your expertise. And to everyone who's watching, thank you for taking the time to invest in the health and well-being of trans and non-binary people.